I'm on the right side of the screen. You know what that means. I've said this the last 5 times I've reviewed a champion. It means we're talking about a champ today. We are talking about Thor Bayhammer, the champion that was just announced to be the next fusion. We knew for a while he was going to be a fusion, though, but we didn't know his kit. I seen there was some rumblings inside the community, predominantly inside my clan chat, actually, so shout out to whoever had said this. But essentially, they thought that Thor might be a mythical, and that's why they were holding off on releasing his kit. I thought to myself it would be a little bit interesting if they released him as a mythical when Odin himself is still just a legendary. That would have been quite an upstart inside the, or an upsurge, or like an uptick inside the, the traditional Asgardian kind of lore that goes along with it, right? Anyways, we're talking about Thor here today, the next fusion. Is he any good? Let's go ahead and take a look at his kit. His A1 is Wrath of Mjolnir, attacks one enemy 2 times, has a 20% chance of repeating the attack. Each hit decreases the target's turn meter by 10%. Let's think about this. If he repeats the attack, that's a 4-time hitter, which is probably going to have a decent multiplier as well, especially considering it's a 2-time hitter. If the target's turn meter can be decreased, that is a 40% turn meter reduction as long as he has the accuracy to land this skill. So if you're progressing inside Fire Knight normal, if you're going against any sort of an enemy that can have their turn meter decreased, right? So say, for example, Dark Fae inside the Doom Tower, this guy could be fantastic as well. And he's just really good for trying to break through those shields and stuff like that of Fire Knight and all those sorts of good things, especially if you're trying to progress in certain areas of the game. A2, Fulminous Rocket, attacks all enemies. After attacking the first enemy, will hit every other enemy in a random order. Following the initial hit, each subsequent hit increases the damage inflicted by 25%, stacks up to 100%, will ignore block damage, and unkillable. This effect does not work against bosses. I thought to myself, I was like, why does this matter? Where would we actually have to worry about bosses having block damage? And I was like, right, they just added a new dungeon that has a block damage mechanic on it, so that makes sense. Unkillable, I don't think there's really too many bosses that are placing unkillable on themselves, unless, for example, Hydra steals your buffs or something like that. Something I want to mention. So, this is an AoE. After hitting the first enemy, attacks every other enemy in a random order. Let's think about an area like Arena, for example. Let's think about an area like Hydra. There are 4 enemies, which means that you're only going to get 3 extra hits, so you're only getting a 75% damage increase. You're not going to be able to make use of that full 100% damage increase in those particular areas of the game. That being said, I do think this mechanic is going to work quite well, because in Hydra, for example, you're going to get that initial AoE burst, and then you're also going to get the single target damage after. So that's going to be pretty cool, considering there are some AoE mitigation inside Hydra. His A2 is going to help to kind of get around that, to circumvent it, right? Which is going to be pretty cool to test out, especially if this has a good multiplier, right? We'll have to see what the multiplier is, especially on that single target hit, because if it's a very low multiplier and it doesn't hit hard, it's going to be kind of a questionable skill. Hammer of Heaven, A3, attacks all enemies. Before attacking, places an increased crit damage and an increased attack on this champion for 2 turns. 100% chance of permanently decreasing the resistance of each enemy by 10%, stacks up to 50%. Also, 100% chance of placing a decreased speed debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. So that's a pretty decent skill on a damage dealer. That's on a 3-turn cooldown, which is quite nice. The thing that I'm thinking about this, though, is if you're trying to decrease the resistances. So let's think about, for example, Arena again, right? Average resistance at, let's say, Gold 5, you're probably looking at, I would say, about 500 to 600 resistance minimum, meaning this guy is going to need about 450 to 500 accuracy to reliably land this, because it doesn't say that this can't be resisted, so unless they missed some subtext there, like they did with Harima's skill, for example, her A2 just has an irresistible defense decrease. So if this doesn't need accuracy to land, this skill is going to be incredible by decreasing that resistance. If it does need accuracy to land, it's going to be kind of questionable, because when you get a damage dealer, and you already have to build them with attack and some HP to survive and speed to meet certain thresholds and crit rate and then crit damage, and you also need to have a little bit of defense on them for extra survivability depending where you're using them. Once you start throwing accuracy into that equation as well, you're just prioritizing so many different stats that it's going to be hard to get the same caliber of builds for most players. So if we think about, let's say, a banner, right? So if you need that extra almost 100 accuracy on the banner versus a flat stat attack primary on the banner, you're missing, I believe it's 265 on a 6-star fully upgraded banner. I Somebody correct me on that, though, if I'm wrong in the comments, but that's almost 300 attack that you're missing out on, which is no small amount by any means. So I really hope that this does not require accuracy to land, because again, if it doesn't have those accuracy requirements, this is going to be an insane skill to be able to decrease, say, for example, a Galathir's resistance in the arena, or a Duchess's resistance, or of course, you know, a Hydra Head's resistance as well, especially if you're going against those Nightmare Waves, decreasing resistance inside the Doom Tower, for example, as well, Sidious and Tronos. There's a lot of areas we could use this, even if it does require accuracy, but we wouldn't really be able to build him for nukes if he needs accuracy for this. That being said, let's get into his passive. His passive is interesting because his passive is also an attack, which means it's also going to have a multiplier. Every time this champion deals damage, increases the thunder counter by 1, stacks up to 10. Each thunder stack increases this champion's damage by 3%, stacks up to 30%. So obviously at the full 10, you're going to have the 30% increase. Once the thunder counter reaches 10, attacks all enemies and places a stun for 1 turn. After the attack, the thunder counter resets to 0. Couple things to mention with this. First of all, Plarium tend to have a very questionable way of implementing new features into the game. This is the first time we've seen a thunder counter on a champion, so it raises a lot of questions. First of all, is it going to count as a buff so that somebody like a Tormund can freeze you? Second, if it's a buff, can it be stripped? Can it be stolen? Or can it be decreased? So for example, if you're going in the arena and you're going against the Sun Wukong, can Sun Wukong open with his A3 and just steal your thunder counters and then have an increased damage on him? Or is it going to be some sort of a protected buff? If it's a protected buff, is that going to mess with a champion like a Mighty Ukko, where his strip and then block buffs is predicated on the enemy team having no buffs? So is this guy essentially just going to be a free ticket to deal with some sort of a strip like that, or some sort of like a conditional, if this champion has no buffs, does this kind of thing? Because there are a few champions like that in the game, right? So it's going to be very interesting to see how they implement this. The only way I can think it would make sense is if it's coded like a blessing. So if it's like a lightning cage or something like that, where it's not technically a buff and it can't be interacted with as a buff, right? So that would be the way I would see them doing it, but I don't know. And it should also be protected, I would say, because if it's unique to this guy's kit, you don't want another champion stealing it, if that would also have the same effect on them, right? So if you have a Sun Wukong who's just ramping up his damage because he stole your Thor's Thunder Blessings, that doesn't really make much sense, right? So once the Thunder counter reaches 10, attacks all enemies. So this means once your counter reaches 10, you don't actually get a chance really to use that full 30% damage increase, because it's automatically going to reset. Depending on how hard this passive hits, it could be an absolute AoE nuke though as well, where you're trying to activate it as much as possible. If we think about an ally attack champion, for example, let's say we bring in Lady Mikage and a Farrakhan the Fat with this guy. Let's say we have 1 extra attack, so an extra repeat attack. So if we ally attack with Farrakhan, he goes in, he hits the enemy twice, he triggers that 20% chance, hits them twice more. Then we go in, we attack with Lady Mikage, he hits them twice again. Off those 2 ally attacks alone, this guy is already going to be at 6 stacks. Worst case scenario, he's at 4 stacks, right? Because of his 2 hitters. Best case scenario, he's at 8. So he can ramp himself up into this skill pretty quick. And of course, on his A2, he's doing basically a minimum of like 7 hits, depending on which area of the game you're using him, right? So you attack everybody, then after hitting the first enemy, it attacks every other enemy in a random order. Actually, now that I'm reading that, this raises another question. So it says attacks all enemies after hitting the first enemy. So it doesn't say it's an AoE and then it duplicates damage. It just says after hitting the first enemy. So if you don't know, in Raid Shadow Legends, the way it works already is on an AoE, you're essentially going 1 by 1. So if you have 4 different champions, you're basically AoE, boom, 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 boom. It's not coded as everybody takes the damage, right? So that's important because, for example, some effects like Polymorph, for example, will only take effect after you've hit the champion, or after you've tried to apply the effect to the champion that has the Sheep Bliss. So this is interesting because I didn't realize that before. I thought it was an AoE, everybody gets hit, and then after hitting this guy, he's going to go boom, boom, boom. But no, the way this says it, it's just an AoE where after hitting boom, will attack everybody else in a random order, which implies that as AoEs are now, you're basically going boom, boom, boom. But with this skill, you might go boom, boom, boom. That's a terrible way to explain it. A lot of booms. Free drinking game for you there. Take a shot every time I said boom. You'd probably be in the ER, so don't do that. I don't take any legal accountability for your actions. This is interesting. Let me know down below. The last thing with this guy's kit too, real quick, is increase ally attack in all battles by 30%. Let me know down below what you think of his kit so far. I've seen some chatter on Facebook that he might be similar to like a Xena. I don't really think he's going to be similar to a Xena because he doesn't really have anything in his kit that makes Xena who she is, especially with that turn meter boost and whatnot, right? So I don't really think he's going to be an arena meta champion or anything like that because we have champions that should be doing kind of what he does, but a little bit better. That being said, though, with his A2, so if it can hit hard and if it doesn't need accuracy to decrease that resistance, this champion is actually going to be pretty cool. As it stands right now, though, I think I might be spending my resources to try and get the Freya guaranteed event instead of going for the fusion, so that's kind of where I'm standing on it. Let me know what you guys think, though. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.